Hi everyone, welcome to this week's lesson. This is going to be the final lesson of this term, and also the final lesson in a series covering basic figure drawing. So we're going to be sort of reconciling everything that we've done so far in this lesson, developing certain aspects. Beyond this point, you'll have all the tools that you need to carry on a drawing to whatever level of completion that you like. So we've gone from just a simple gesture drawing into a basic construct drawing. Then we've looked at placing shadow shapes, then looking for variations within those shadows. And last week we started to add large halftone masses, and this week we're going to start rendering the medium and smaller forms. So last week we put in these halftones into the light, and this week we're going to be starting to actually model specific forms within those general areas. So we didn't really go into too much modelling out of all the halftones into the lights or modelling in areas within the lights last week. And this final stage makes it pretty much look like a complete representational drawing. As I've said before, you can always combine stages. As you become more competent, more confident, you'll be able to kind of merge different stages or skip stages in certain parts of the drawing and carry on. But this is just a general kind of introduction to how I would separate all of the different stages of a figure drawing. And obviously there's kind of infinite variety within those stages to put your own mark on your style. But this just gives you a general idea. So there's a few things, kind of three things we're going to be thinking about today while we add smaller forms. The first follows on from last week, and that's thinking about the general fall of light within the figure. So we looked at the idea that this area up in the shoulder is receiving more of the light source coming down from up here in the top right corner than say the feet. So generally we want that to be the lightest area. So all the forms in this area are going to be generally lighter than the forms down here. There are exceptions to that, so as the form turns to shadow, this shadow is obviously a similar darkness to the shadow on the foot. Those values, as they start to approach the bedbug line, the line that separates light from dark, will get as dark here as they do up there. We're thinking more about forms within the lighter areas, so you might get sort of muscles around the back that kind of connect to these bulges. Those forms would be generally lighter than, let's say, some of the forms down here in the knees or some of the articulations around the feet. We sort of just want to keep the, almost like this is slightly blown out, if you imagine, in photography. And the second thing is we want to treat each form with care. So we want to look at how each individual smaller form relates to the whole and also relates to each other. So you'll have forms next to one another, muscles that have to combine and work in a certain way. Smaller forms will connect to outside contours and internal shadows, so we'll want to think about how the form relates to the shadows that we've already described. And finally we want to think about texture. So certain parts of the drawing are going to be more textured than others. Let's say down here in his lower leg, it's sort of slightly hairy, so these values down here will be a bit patchier. More like a patchwork of values than his shoulder, which is a lot smoother, so they'll be more softly rendered. Around his beard again will be more patchy and textured. We're also going to think about specularity, although there's not too much. Specularity is sort of how shiny something is, so there aren't too many places in this drawing that are shiny. Everything's more generally matte. The hair, I suppose, has certain bits of shine on it, which we might get into. Usually shinier areas occur on the face, which might be oilier or where there's more bone exposed. So noses tend to be quite shiny, foreheads, and so on. But you do get a certain variation in shininess. Parts of the body covered in hair are less shiny than areas that are completely smooth, as a general rule as well. So we can begin. I might just, at this stage in the drawing, you might find that if you start resting your hand on the paper, you might start to smudge things, which you don't want to do because everything's starting to get quite neat. So you want to use some sort of implement just to keep your hand slightly raised off the paper. I'm just using a brush here, but you can get longer things called mile sticks, which I think is spelled M-A-H-L. I use them for painting to make sure. It's even worse with painting because you don't want your hand resting on wet paint. The other thing I did in the break between this week and last is I started to add a background tone last week, and I just sort of evened it out during the break, just so that basically if you have an even background tone, then the form will sit, or the form of the figure will sit more with better clarity up to the front of the image. So it makes quite a big difference if you watched last week. The difference between this light shoulder now that it's got a darker tone behind it, it glows a lot more. So now that we start to add all these forms, it's going to work even better. I'm using a mixture of pencils this week. So this clutch, I have a 2B, I think, or a B graphite shaft in, and then I'm also using an F, which is very, very hard. And I'll be using that just for kind of any kind of little bits of evening that you need, kind of filling in gaps and that sort of thing. And I've also, as far as tools go, I've got a kneadable eraser, and I've also got a homemade sanding block. That pretty much covers it. So mostly this week I'll just be talking through the ideas. The way that you develop smaller forms is the same as the way you develop a large form, but just on a smaller scale. So we leave these smaller forms to this point in the drawing when we're reasonably happy with how things are going. And they're just sort of minor adjustments, but they do start to really make the drawing work better. So one thing I'm going to begin with is I'm just going to darken this foot slightly, kind of generally, though I might create a little bit. It's a cast shadow on that foot. I'm not entirely confident it should necessarily be in my drawing because I think it may actually be from the light source that we emitted. So there is a secondary light source in my reference that I've ignored for the sake of clarity for you guys, which makes it slightly trickier to do, but it's an interesting thing for you to do as an exercise, or see as an exercise. Something like that might work for that foot. As we say, we want to keep it generally a little bit darker. And while we're at it, we can start looking at these. So these are the sorts of smaller forms we're looking at. This 10, sort of where this toe separates from the pad of the foot. How the pad of the foot kind of gradually turns out of this shadowed bedbug line. Start looking at texture wise, we're looking at these wrinkles. And again, these darker halftones turning out of the So I'm looking pretty closely as I work at my reference. And at this point you're kind of working between both the shadows and the lights. So you can skip back and forwards between them. This will be our final session, so I'm just going to try to bring everything to a level that I'm generally happy with. As I say, with these principles you can apply to your own drawings, and you can just take them as far as you like. So you could stop earlier in a drawing like this. You could sketch in most of the figure and then only render in this way a small portion of it, rather than rendering everything like most of it like I have. So you can see that now that we've started to add these smaller forms in, the foot feels a bit more complete. there's a bit more sense to what's going on with it. And that's what we're looking for. There's no point really in adding information unless in some way it adds a bit more to what's going on in the drawing, either compositionally or it makes sense of something that you're looking at that maybe doesn't quite make sense without elaboration. So I might jump up to this knee, start looking at these forms. I'm going to try to keep the forms in the knee reasonably blocky. So certain parts of the image you might want to be smoother, say in the shoulder or the muscles in the back. But generally, anywhere where you've got a lot of bone sticking out, like the knee or around the elbows or parts of the head, you want your planes to remain reasonably blocky, because it sort of re-emphasizes or emphasizes the sense of it being a bony section of the body. So while I'm adding in all these forms, I'm thinking about where the light source is, and how the relationship of the form to the light source will affect it. So all of these forms are sort of turning kind of out from the shadow in the left towards the light. You also want to think about the shape of the shadows. So you can see the shadow kind of juts back and forwards, and that occurs because there are different forms. So there's this form underneath the kneecap here that's sort of looping around. There's another form just underneath it which also juts out. Then you've got this flat panel which is kind of gradually turning out of the shadow, so we can make that more of a soft transition. Got another little section here slightly turning out of this shadow underneath the thigh, and then these shadows so this form is kind of wrapping around, the knee juts forward, and then there's this sort of secondary form here where the thigh muscle is bulging out. So we're just gradually turning from the shadow into the light. So I'm trying not to add any tone into the center of the form, this form here. I'm just working on the outside edge. So I want to do as much as possible just using the outside edge. Now this shadow is a cast shadow from the opposite arm. And cast shadows, basically the further away the shadow is from where it's being cast, the softer it becomes. So looking, it's called a penumbra, the shadow. So as well as the penumbra, we've got the form shadow itself, which is turning basically like a cylinder turning away from the light. So it's definitely worth, if necessary, removing tone as well. So you may have done something a little bit over the top in last week when you were blocking in your halftones within individual forms. So we were working with kind of large general areas last week. So you can use a mixture of erasing and shading to create the desired texture and value that you want in any particular area. But it's just a case of working back and forth essentially between adding tone, removing tone, adding detail or removing it. So you can see all these shapes now make a bit more sense than they did before. We had all these kind of little jutting shapes caused by the shadow, us kind of delineating the shadow shape earlier. But as we start to add these smaller forms, we finally start to kind of make sense of them. And everything comes together a lot more effectively at this point in the drawing. So that would probably do it for the leg, that back leg. As I say, you can carry on adding as much detail as you like. You can keep refining and refining, but I just want to show you as much as is necessary so that you can sort of work on your own and be comfortable starting from scratch. It's always important to keep a sharp pencil, but when you're working on details like this, it needs to stay particularly sharp. So we'll leave that leg as it is for now. It's kind of nice how it sort of softly fades out into the backdrop a bit there. That softer line will make it potentially pushed back a little bit from the foreground. So we're going to maybe try to create something of a point of interest here in the shoulder. Might struggle a bit because there's a little bit of information lost around the tattoo, but we'll see how we go. For the time being, I'm going to keep going in the lower body and drop down to this other leg. So we did that lower foot, but we now want to have a look at the leg itself. So again, forms around knees are always pretty complex. An interesting part of the body to work with. Quite mechanical looking in a lot of ways. So I'm going to start looking for how that knee joint works. This is where a reasonably good understanding of anatomy becomes very useful. So you at least kind of know what the different joints are doing, how they work. The more you understand about anatomy, the more you can kind of play up or play down certain features of it to give a certain impression. So a lot of artists use a sense that one muscle, say a muscle, is more tense than it would normally be in a certain part of the body to give a kind of a sense of energy being stored. We talked a little bit about that with while we were working with gestures. So sometimes you might have very, let's say, tense back muscles in a figure on one side of the body, and it gives a sense that that side of the body has more kind of stored energy than the other that might be more relaxed. So I'm just moving from form to form and seeing how they all connect. Ultimately, what I want to get this knee to do is I want it to feel like it's projecting out towards us, which it is. Which is going to require a little bit of sort of jigging around these shapes. I'm just trying to create this sense of a kind of flatter top with the top of the patellas exposed just where I'm working right now. I think there is a little bit of a highlight in there. Sometimes you do get highlights on the knee. That pretty much does it for that knee. We've also got this indent here, bottom of the thigh muscle again, which is quite prominent on both sides of the leg. So I want to get that to turn effectively. And a little bit of a connecting form there. And generally, we would expect this side of the thigh to be darker than the other. Also got this overlap here where the bum is slightly obscured by the thigh, which is an example of foreshortening. Just going to erase a little bit of the central portion of this thigh. Something like that's probably not too far off. So we can now start to move into the arms, and then we're moving into the upper body and head, which will kind of finish it off. But that's pretty much, I mean, that's, as I say, you could always keep pushing stuff further and further, but for a reasonable finish, that's not too bad. And it also depends on, say, how much time you have with the model, or how good your reference is, how detailed the photograph is. But yeah, so if we skip go across to this arm now, which is fairly straightforward. It's mostly just a darker halftone next to the bedbug line, just to create more of a sense of it turning. I think we talked a little bit last week about this vein, which creates a sharper edge down the lower portion of the arm. But this shadow here, which I think is partially cast, like a cast shadow, is quite soft. So in order to give, it's almost a textural thing, that veininess. So you want that to feel crisp, but this to feel soft, this transition. And by putting in this softer transition next to the crisper transition, it'll reinforce just how stark the veinier section is, which is what we're after. So there are even tinier forms in these fingers, which we're not going to be overly concerned with. They're really tiny forms, so just get a general sense of the knuckles turning out. Hands also tend to be quite blocky, kind of angular shapes, so you don't have as many smooth transitions. The pad of the hand that I'm working on right now tends to be quite smooth, but the fingers themselves will usually be reasonably sort of blocky values. Mainly probably actually with the hands, I'd say we'd need to just go in and add some of these really dark notes. Just to separate the hand from the rest of the face a little bit. So looking at the cast shadows. Something like that works pretty well for the hand. But I'll jump back to the other arm. Actually, I might work slightly on this outside. This outside edge here is a little bit too crisp now that we've reworked everything else so much to become a lot softer. Possibly a little bit too angular. Can be nice to keep angular things from earlier times in the drawing. This one's a little bit excessive, or certainly maybe this top section is. So I'm just going to erase that and then go in and rework it slightly. So begin just by fixing up the background, where the background meets that portion of the drawing. And then start to go in and work a bit more, soften out these forms. Something like that. It's just something I'd noticed that we probably ought to look at, or ought to have looked at by this point. Jumping around a little bit there. Just going to sharpen my pencil again. Jump back to this arm we're working on. So again, this arm's reasonably straightforward. We do have a form here. This kind of bonier section where the wrist is, which we want to give a little bit of clarity to. The rest of it is kind of more just a general rounded form, so it just kind of gradually turns out. It's a little bit darker as it goes down the arm due to the fall of light. And there's going to be a little bit more articulation around the elbow. So you can see that's starting to turn that arm, so it starts to feel a lot more three-dimensional. I'm going to work that all the way along this edge just out of the bedbug line. I'm starting to think a bit about the anatomy of the arm now that I'm working more in the specific smaller form. So we're looking for a sort of deltoid shape over here. It's not super obvious in the reference, partly due to the tattoos, as I say. So it's something I'm going to work a little bit just from a knowledge of anatomy and try to get it to look reasonably good. Here as well is a reasonably subtle form, but there is this kind of slightly more angular section there where the elbow sticks out. Then we're going to look at this form up here where the shoulder's going to go a little bit kind of flat over the, well, it's almost more of a neck muscles kind of lying over where the deltoid would be coming out of. So it's a bit of guessing work with this, just because the reference isn't great. If you're working from life, it would be a lot easier. But as I was saying at the beginning of the lesson, we don't want to over darken any of these forms in the arm because they will otherwise start to feel over modeled, which we don't want. So this is more of a cast shadow coming out into the neck. So it's just a bit more gradual, not a form shadow specifically. And then we've got these back muscles turning into that shadow just at the top of the shoulder. And then we've got what we would have a flatter plane sitting over the top. Something like this. Going to keep them very faint as they're working into that lightest portion of our drawing. It's not too bad for that shoulder. We've got some dark lines that are still a bit visible from when I blocked the shadow in, which are kind of impeding that form a little bit. So I'm just going to go get rid of those and refill it back in. Just even out that tone slightly. Yeah, that'll roughly do. I'm going to drop back down to these forms, these little shadows that are creating a little bit of form in the lower portion of the back. These lateral muscles, which can probably be a little bit darker just to create a distinction. Also here actually. Particularly on this side. So you've got this kind of undulation going on all the way up the back, and then this one also needs a little bit of blending coming out of it. This muscle kind of does this, so it's drooping down and then overlapping. Not too bad, and then we've got these flat planes and the torso. Though I am tempted to get rid of them because I think they're actually cast from the back side of the drawing. So I might, at this point, now that everything else is rendered, you'll find you get certain things just really don't make sense. And I would say these flatter planes, certainly being so light and looking like they're lit by this light above, just don't quite make sense. So I'm going to get rid of them. But we don't want to quite lose the sense of where that neck is, so just going to keep that moderately dark. We've also got this form here is like a sort of double. And I'll just sort of generally even that out. We'd probably want to spend a little bit of time making a bit more sense of that after making that quite big difference, that big change. But for the time being, I think we'll leave it at that for that aspect. So the last thing that we need to look at finishing off is the head. Actually, I might just... There's a bit of a jagged edge here now, I've noticed in this form. So I might just go in and even that slightly and then rework that distinction. Yeah, we'll leave it at that. Just about. There's one slight more change I'll do. Yeah, leave it like that's fine. So finally, we're going to look at the head. It's actually reasonably well blocked in the head as it is, but there are a few little changes we can make. So we could start to, texturally, it's kind of interesting. We can start to look at the beard, how we want to get that to look the way that it's lit. Some sort of scratchier lines just to give the impression of the right sort of texture. Usually you'd find you'd need to spend a lot of time working on the head just because anytime you've got the face visible, it's always a big kind of initial focal point for anyone looking at your drawing. In this particular case, because he's got his hand covering his head, we don't have to worry quite so much. It becomes a piece a bit more focused on the actual figure rather than the portrait aspect of it. But you will find it's always worth spending a bit of time on the head if you're doing a figure drawing that does actually show the head. So there we're just kind of starting to add a bit more kind of scratchier textures to give a better sense of the hair, particular texture that you get in hair. So try to give the sense of it being combed in the particular way that it is. Maybe at this point go in and give a little bit more specific definition to that ear. get it to sit a little bit more comfortably in the head. Also, everything else is, the detail of everything else has become a bit more clear, so it makes sense that you want to start anything that seems kind of unusually lacking in detail, you want to amend at this point. Yeah, that pretty much does it. Could use this, now I've got my B out, can go in and make some of these little notes a bit darker. So at this point you could go around and find anywhere you want a lot of contrast. You want to go in and kind of create slight notches of dark, and those will become your focal points compositionally. So the eye tends to be drawn to places of highest contrast. So probably in this drawing at the moment, the head is in a lot of contrast. So you'd maybe look at the head first, and then your eye would kind of drop down. It's a nice composition, the original photograph that I've worked from. And in any composition, you as the artist can sort of push or pull things around, make certain aspects less obvious, or emphasize things that you want to be more obvious. So anyway, you put contrast, you put sharper lines will start to pop out of the whole. And that's sort of I guess the final thing that you want to look at with a figure drawing. It's also the first thing you look at, so when you're first starting a drawing, particularly as you get more competent and confident with your work, these are the sorts of things you'd think about before you even start drawing. What do you want to emphasize? What aspect of the drawing interests you most? And then you can kind of tailor your approach to those initial thoughts that you have about the pose, or what kind of really appeals to you. But yeah, that pretty much does it. We'll leave it at that for today, and that's it for this series. So that's 6 lessons that just basically cover beginning to end this particular figure drawing, and the skills you can apply to anything that you're doing. So if you're working from references online, pretty much like I was in the demo, that'll work fine. Or if you want to go try this sort of stuff out in a life drawing class, that's also really great. I'd recommend, if you can get to a life drawing class, it's better than working online, just because you never have this issue I was talking about, where you maybe lose a little bit of detail, you're not quite sure what it would look like in a different light. In a life drawing class, those sorts of things can be figured out a lot more easily. Just going in and adding little texturally some chest hair to the figure. Just sort of scratching a bit over there. Just getting a little bit more differentiation between that. Yeah, something like that. You can also go in and mess around with the props at this point in the drawing, so any shadows, or maybe I'd want to add more of a bit more tone down into the floor plane, maybe just to get it to sort of transition out and not be quite so stark. It already kind of does on that right hand side. But yeah, that pretty much covers it. So hopefully it's been interesting. I'm going to obviously, as always, upload a document to the blog and also to the OCAD page. And for any of you who are subscribed, once you've had a go at this exercise, get in touch. I can have a look at your work and give you some advice. And I'll see you in a few weeks when the new term starts. Thanks for watching. I'll see you guys soon. Actually, just before I do that, I'll lift my camera off because it usually has to be at a sort of skewed angle. means you don't quite get the figure in the right perspective. So I can show you a quick little zoom in on how the pencil application worked, so you can see stuff in a little bit more detail, which is always helpful. But yeah, that's it. That concludes that cycle of lessons, and I'll see you guys soon.